Hi everybody. In this video I want to start talking about another kind of informal fallacy. These are called the fallacies of weak induction, and they're a little different from the previous set of fallacies in that the points that are brought up are not exactly irrelevant to the conclusion, but they just don't provide strong evidence for the conclusion. And there's not as much of a pattern. These don't fit together quite as well as the previous set of fallacies. It's more of a hodgepodge of different things. In any case, the first one that I want to talk about is called appeal to unqualified authority. This is the kind of argument where someone tells you, well, so-and-so said this, and so you should believe it too. We talked about an argument that was sort of like that in the last section when the so-and-so who said it was just kind of everyone or else some kind of peer group that you that the person wanted you to feel obligated to fit into. Here, there's a different kind of appeal going on. It's suggested that the other person, the person you should listen to, is some kind of authority. And so somehow, either it's claimed that they're experts or just somehow they're in a position of authority that you should listen to them, so that they're special in some way. And we're not saying that, by calling this a fallacy, we're not saying that, it's never acceptable to pay attention to what others have concluded about something. This kind of cliche about never let anyone do your thinking for you. That's not exactly possible to follow to the T, is it? I mean, the span of human knowledge now is such that there's no person on earth can be an expert on every field that's out there. And most of us, in fact, are not experts on very many things. So we often have to listen to the opinion of established experts about something. But a lot of times this kind of reasoning is sort of rife for abuse. And so people sort of flagrantly put appeals out there to someone who is just in a position of maybe they're just famous or something. This is where you see these kind of arguments made in advertising, right? Where it's sort of an implicit argument often in an ad, where they put Shaquille O'Neal on the ad for the car or something, right? And he says, this is roomy. I know about roomy or something. So it sort of implies some kind of expertise on like what car you should buy, or didn't he do? Shaq does like ads for everything, right? So he did like the icy hot, right, for your muscles, and shaving cream and all kinds of stuff. And the idea there is you're supposed to go, star power is just supposed to overcome you, and you're supposed to go, wow, it's Shaquille O'Neal. He uses this razor, so it must be a great razor, so I'll buy it. So we don't need to get real subtle in order to deal with those kinds of fallacies where it's just a blatant appeal to the person being famous. But there are also more subtle cases, and so I wanted to go into this a little bit more than what's given in the book. It's sort of simplified there. So what's going on generally is that someone's encouraging you to accept what others believe, and it's claimed that they have some kind of special expertise in the subject, and that's not that doesn't make it a bad argument, right? There are plenty of cases where if I go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you have these tests came back and you have a high cholesterol, so you should do something about your cholesterol. You need to eat healthier, exercise, so on. And if I was to go on the internet for a couple of days or something and read about cholesterol and come back and say to my doctor, well, I was reading about cholesterol on the internet for the last couple of days, and it seems to me that this cholesterol stuff isn't really that bad, and I was looking at it's lipids, right? And at that point maybe my doctor's gonna smack me across the face, right, and say, yeah, go to medical school for 10 years, then maybe we'll talk, maybe we'll have discussion about this. But I am not in a position to really evaluate that at my my present level of understanding of that material. So it is wise sometimes, right? It does make sense the fact that doctors agree cholesterol is unhealthy, cholesterol is a high risk factor, that's a reason to think that it is, because uh, there's uh, there's overwhelming consensus among doctors about this, and it's an area where we know what's going on with it. So if certain conditions are in place, then this is a reasonable kind of argument to make. If the conditions are not in place, then it's a fallacy. So let's talk about the conditions. If the argument appeals to the authority of people who aren't really experts in that subject, or if they're not experts at all, then you were committing a fallacy. So, for example, I gave you the example of going to the doctor about the cholesterol and taking his word for it on that. If I ask a doctor, if I happen to be having a conversation, let's say with a doctor, and it's somebody slipped on my porch and they broke their leg, and I'm wondering if they're going to be able to sue me. And suppose we have a doctor who's they're not going to, most people aren't going to say something, but suppose the doctor says, well, broke their leg? Well, let me tell you, I'm an expert on broken legs. I'm a doctor. I know all about broken legs, and I can tell you, there's no way they can sue you on that. It's not your fault, right? Well, and suppose everybody says, yeah, well, yeah, he's a doctor, so he should know. Right? That's not his area of expertise. Yes, it's about a broken leg, but it's about the legal consequences of the broken leg. It's not about, the medical facts about it. A lot of times that's the way this fallacy gets disguised, right? Because the person is an expert on something that's like related to the subject, but he's not actually an expert on, really what the topic is, which is it's a legal question, right? Not a medical question. So that's one kind of case where this fallacy gets committed. Another case, if there's a lack of consensus among experts on the subject. So there are experts on this subject, but they don't agree. Then you can't pick one, right, and just say, oh, so and so is an expert on economic theory. Milton Friedman is an expert on economic theory, and his position is that during a time of recession, the government should decrease spending. I think that's an area where economists don't really agree. So you could pick, this economist say he thinks during a recession you should decrease government spending. You could pick another economist who says during recession government should increase spending. And yes, they're experts, but the fact that the experts split down the middle on this means you can't just pick one and say, whoa, Friedman says this, right? There has to be consensus among the experts in order for us as non-experts, right, to appeal to what the experts say, right? Otherwise, then we're just we can't do this kind of argument. We have to either make up our minds for ourselves on this, which sometimes is we're not in a position to do that. Like with the economic stuff, I don't know that we're really in a position to make that determination. And at the same time, we can't appeal to the experts, which leaves us in a position of having to sort of either suspend judgment, but sometimes you can't. So it could really be a problem, actually, if there's a lack of consensus among experts. But you can't do this kind of argument. You can't do this appeal to unqualified, or you can't do this appeal to authority in this case. By the way, I'm not crazy about the title that we give it here, appeal to unqualified authority. As I just want to make, I don't want to oversimplify this quite so much. It's not always that the authority is unqualified. If there's no consensus, well then, the authority is still qualified. The person's still qualified, but, if there's no consensus, it's a different problem. Another kind of problem is that if you're appealing to authority in the wrong kind of subject matter in general. Some subjects, there's an established body of knowledge about that subject. And so you can do this kind of argument, the cholesterol thing, right? There's an established body of knowledge about the biology of the human body and how cholesterol works. There's things that aren't known, but there is a body of knowledge so that you can make that legitimate appeal. There are other subject areas where even though you might have experts, it's not a subject where you have established knowledge. You know, philosophy or theology, these kinds of subjects. If somebody says, well, you know, most philosophers are atheists, and you know, so therefore there surely must not be a God, because most people who have looked into these kind of philosophical arguments about it end up being atheists. That's not a legitimate appeal to authority. I'd love to say you can do this with philosophy, right? But philosophy is one area where you can there's very few topics in philosophy where you can say, you know, if most philosophers think so, then it must be true. It's just not. It's not the kind of subject where we have an established body of knowledge. To be an expert means a different thing in that kind of field. I mean, I'm not exactly sure that I can give you some kind of precise conditions about what I mean by an area of established knowledge. It has something to do with having a track record of being able to make predictions and being able to confirm things in a multiplicity of different ways. So I don't know that I can go much further than that in what I mean by saying an area of established knowledge, but we can have a general, I think, idea that there are these areas where there's established knowledge. A fourth kind of problem, and this is mentioned in the book, is when you have experts and these conditions may or may not be met, or they may be close to being met, but somehow the experts are untrustworthy. So I think there's an example in the book where they take Kim Jong-il's word as an expert on the North Korean, or it's Kim Jong-un now, sorry, on the North Korean nuclear program. He says they're not building any weapons strictly for energy purposes. And then suppose somebody were to say, well, he knows about what they're doing. I mean, he is the dictator of the country, so he is an expert on what's going on in North Korea, right? Which, of course, right, he is an expert. He would know what they're doing. They're doing whatever he says. So, yeah, he's an expert. The problem is that he's an expert we can't trust, right? So we can't take his word that, you know, it's all strictly devoted to energy conservation. So if one of those things happens, then we have this fallacy of appeal to unqualified authority.